Today, Linda's come here to talk about 100 years of Hudson Valley sightings in New York State, that is. And just to introduce Linda, she's a research scientist turned award-winning author of over 30 books. 30 books, Linda, my goodness. On science, history, the paranormal, and fiction. She's lectured across the USA and has appeared on numerous TV and radio shows. Starred in the documentary In the Night Sky, I Recall a UFO, which was based on her research into sightings in the Hudson Valley of New York. And the film won the 2013 People's Choice Award at the EBE Film Festival at the International UFO Congress. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
It's only 10 years late.
10 years. Wow.
Her 3 UFO books are In the Night Sky, Hudson Valley UFOs, and More Hudson Valley UFOs. And Hudson Valley Magazine twice named her best author in the Hudson Valley. So Linda has a monthly radio show called UFO Headquarters on hudsonriverradio.com. So if you want to hear more of what she has to say, jump over there. So thank you very much, Linda, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks. I'm happy to be back. It's Friday night at 8 p.m. here. So speaking across the international date line here. So I grew up in the Hudson Valley, which is a region just north of New York City. Beautiful area, mountains on either side of the river. And once you get out of New York, it can get fairly rural. I have a dairy farm within walking distance of me, yet in 45 minutes I can be in downtown Manhattan. So some little towns, over the years it's built up a little, but still you can think of it as a suburban to semi-rural area. So I'm going to talk about some of the early sightings and then concentrate on what I consider to be the most incredible wave in UFO history, which took place in the 80s. Thank you, Cheryl, for mentioning my 3 books. They are currently out of print because I put them all together in one book. I had enough material for a 4th book, and I said, this is getting ridiculous. It's getting like an encyclopedia, so I might as well put it all into one volume. So all the triangle cases together, all the abductions. So this is the latest work. It's 8.5 by 11, and I think it weighs about 5 pounds. So you really want to be interested in this topic before you get this book. And then, of course, this was the animal reactions book that I spoke about last time. And thank you again for mentioning UFO Headquarters, where I talk a lot about the Hudson Valley, since we're here and we're surrounded by all those cases, but have had some very interesting guests over the years. Okay, so let's dive in. So we're actually going back more than 100 years. This is 1876. I love going through old newspapers because you just never know what you're going to find. Now, Sullivan County is just north of me. It's one of the counties comprising the Hudson Valley. It's on the west side of the Hudson. And it's talking about that over the past few weeks, a strange light is being observed near a lake. And they're wondering why it hasn't been investigated. And I love towards the end, they say, why don't the editors fly up there, fly around, and find out for themselves what they want to know? There may be a first-class newspaper sensation spoiling in their hands. Wake up, gentlemen. How many times have we wanted to grab editors by the throat and say, wake up, look at what's going on? But I loved the choice of terms. Why don't they go up there and fly around? That's because whatever this object was, there were lights flying around a lake. Now, 1876, don't have a lot of options here. You have a balloon you could attach a light to, and it would, go up and be at the mercy of the wind. So clearly, well over 100 years ago, there were mysterious lights no one could explain. We have an airport in the Hudson. Well, there's a couple of airports, but Stewart International Airport. It's about 10 minutes from me. And I put a orange blob here down on the bottom. I spoke to a man who he had a family farm here. Again, you have this big airport, but right next to it is still some farmland. But this was a while ago. And he used to spend summers going to getting out of the city and spending summers with his cousins in this beautiful setting. And he said the grandparents and cousins were always talking about this one particular field on their farm where colored lights and kind of circular-ish craft they seem to be attached to would hover and move around this particular field. And, when I first mentioned this to people, they're like, well, they live next to an airport. Of course they're seeing colored lights. But this was in the 1890s when this man I spoke to was about 90, and he used to go to the farm in I think it was the 40s. So his grandparents were seeing these colored lights moving around in the 1890s. Stewart Airport obviously didn't exist because there weren't any airports. So to me, these cases are of vital importance to set the precedent, to show the timeline of events that, we talk about the modern age of UFOs and that it's really a post-World War II phenomena. Not at all. All right, we had a huge wave around 1908 to 1910 in the Hudson Valley, which spread throughout the area. And I just want to show what the state of the art, if we can call it that, aviation was in 1909. This is upper left. This is Orville Wright talking with a Lieutenant Selfridge of the Army. This is one of their planes that could go a whopping 42 miles per hour and maybe stay aloft for an hour. They sold it to the Wright brothers sold it to the Army for $35,000. I think that's about $1 million today. Unfortunately, on the test flight of this little stick and fabric craft, it crashed and Lieutenant Selfridge was killed. He is the first victim, the first death of fatality of powered flight craft, which just goes to show how unreliable they were. We didn't have Zeppelins. We had essentially these flimsy gas bags that were not very reliable, and you can see the pictures there. There were no night flights in 1909. Therefore, there should not have been any lights in the sky. So how do we explain all these dots? The red dots and the lower part just above the city of New York here, that's the Hudson Valley. In the summer of 1909, all the red dots here were mass sightings of what they called mysterious airships. They said that these had big searchlights on them. There were no night flights, and planes weren't carrying searchlights. They could barely carry the pilot. They could hover for long periods of time. They could fly very, very fast. And one aspect I came upon that it hadn't dawned on me originally is altitude. One of the Wright brothers in 1909 set an altitude record. I believe it was 362 feet. We all take the beverage service at 30,000 feet on our jets for granted. 362 feet, that was an enormous amount. a great height. Yet these mysterious airship could fly at thousands of feet. And you can see these purple dots are all from December of 1909. And we had some other sightings over the course of the year. Thousands and thousands of people in this area alone saw these enormous, brightly lit craft that had flight characteristics we simply cannot explain today for that period. Here's another article I came across. What was it? And I love this description. An object in the southern sky resembling an immense box kite attracted much attention from passersby of downtown streets Monday afternoon. The object remained stationary in the air for several hours and at times exhibited green and red colors. This was from the city of Kingston, New York in 1912. What on earth could have been in the skies in 1912 resembling an enormous box kite with red and green colors? So you can, one thing I really need to point out in this case and in all the others, I didn't find one article, one mention where people said, oh my God, we're being invaded by Martians. It's aliens. Everybody thought it was the Wright brothers, or Thomas Edison had his lab not far from this area. People thought some great inventor had created this incredible airship and that any day they were going to reveal it and make millions of dollars and people were going to be flying around the country, any day now. And it never happened because not in the 100 years since, not a blueprint, not a prototype, absolutely no evidence has been found that any person had built any of these craft. And I love this line. No one knows whither they come or whither they go. They apparently start from nowhere and never land. And how many cases can we attribute this comment? Again, they're saying this in 1909. And we can also say this for the wave of the 80s because no one ever saw, we're going to get into the giant triangles. No one ever saw a triangle take off. They never saw one land. So I think I'll have this embroidered and hang this on my wall because it really encapsulates, I think, all generations of UFO sightings. So let's get to that wave of the 1980s. This is a little clip. I just took a screen capture. I don't know if you have, I think you have your own version of Unsolved Mysteries in Australia. Am I correct? Yeah, I think so.
We used to.
Okay, yeah, we used to as well. The
We
American.
do get the US one as well.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
check out, it was, I don't remember which episode, but from 1992, they actually had a really good segment on the early days of the wave. So if you can check that. So clearly we had things going on all the time here, but the really intense wave began December 31st, 1982. And I have been trying for, I don't know how many decades to find someone who saw the craft that night. I hadn't been able to do it until last week. I talked to a woman who witnessed this craft for 30 minutes, and I'll get to the length of these. So one of the first sightings was a retired New York City police detective, and he was celebrating. There was some champagne flowing. In fact, he lived in this town near Carmel, New York, and Route 84, this big yellow highway that goes across the screen from one end to the other. This really was the extraterrestrial highway of that wave. So many people had sightings along 84. Cars would just stop and people would get out. And this is a busy, dangerous highway, so it wasn't the safest thing to do. But where the red arrow one is where his house was. And he decided, since they had just bought a new house, he is going to christen his house by smashing a bottle of champagne against the side of the house. Sounds like a real waste of good champagne, but he smashes this bottle of champagne. And then he realized there's something strange in the sky above him. And not even 500 feet above him, which is very low, he sees this massive boomerang. And people described them as about the size of a football field. That's American football, which is 100 yards. And 3 bright white lights and 15 colored lights. Silent except for a slight hum or vibration. A lot of people described it as, I don't know if I heard it or felt it. You know, when there's that really low kind of rumbling, you kind of feel it. And he sees this craft moving towards Route 84. And here's the arrow right on 84, because shortly after this one man had his sighting, Ed Hansen, he's driving on 84. He sees all of these cars pulled over, so he doesn't know what's happening. So he stops, and then he realized there's this enormous, brightly lit boomerang-shaped craft about 300 feet altitude. That is so low for a huge craft. It's making tight circles over the road, beaming down a white light as if it's searching for something or scanning. And he thinks, boy, I wish it would get closer. I want to get a better look. And one of the things we say here in the Hudson Valley is be careful what you ask for, because as soon as he thought that, the craft turned and started coming straight for him. He panics. He's a grown man, businessman. He was absolutely terrified, started blowing on his horn, screaming for it to go away. And he said there were thoughts that weren't my own. Very chilling. So these are not little lights in the sky. These are intense contact type sightings. And that was day one. And it was to continue for 6 more years. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Phoenix Lights case here in Arizona back in the 90s. Phenomenal case. Thousands of witnesses saw these craft, huge, low. That was a typical day of the week in the Hudson Valley for 6 years. And the characteristics, triangles, V-shaped boomerang, still a lot of discs, massive football field size, silent or a slight hum, very low, often treetop level. I've had so many people said if I had a ball, I could have hit it. If I had a rock, I could have thrown it and hit it. We're talking right at treetop level. Some people said they were afraid it was going to crush a house or a tree. They were so low. Brightly lit, wanting to be seen. One of the skeptics' arguments is they were all stealth government secret projects. So you take your secret project, cover it in lights, and stop it over a major highway. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's one of the criticisms. They could hover. This woman I just interviewed from the New Year's Eve sighting, she saw it hovering in place for 30 full minutes and move rapidly. And when I say move rapidly, like in the blink of an eye, it could be gone. Other types of movements, people say They were looking at it at this point in the sky, and the next thing they knew, they didn't see it move, but it was now 2 miles to the right. It seemed to be able to just jump to positions. And this is getting into a high strangeness, I know, but I cannot tell you how many witnesses have told me they felt some sort of telepathic communication with the craft, either don't be afraid, something like that, or just felt like like that man said, there were thoughts that weren't his own. And each night of sightings, there would be hundreds, if not thousands of witnesses. So many of these sightings, these major sightings, had 4,000 or 5,000 witnesses a night. And you continue that for a couple of times, even once a week for 6 years. It's a staggering amount of sightings. After New Year's Eve of 82, came another big mass sighting, February 26, 1983, in that same area where I showed those last sightings. A woman named Monique O'Driscoll. Now, that movie Close Encounters, where they saw something and he's trying to make it out of whipped potatoes, the Devil's Tower, and someone else keeps drawing and drawing and drawing it. This is one of dozens and dozens of sketches Monique made afterwards. She became obsessed. This looks like a pretty good sketch to me, but it wasn't perfect. She had to keep doing additional sketches. This is an artist's representation. You can see in the car here is her daughter, who Monique had to get out and look at this craft. You can imagine all of these lights reflecting off this frozen pond. The daughter is screaming, "Mom, get back in the car. It's going to take us." She is hysterical. Monique is just mesmerized by this, and they end up following it for several miles and coming upon other witnesses. After it left this area, the craft moved into Western Connecticut, which is bordering, right? This Route 84 leaves this area and enters Connecticut. Danbury is the first city you come upon. This man, Herbert Proudfoot, he was a teacher, is driving along with 2 air traffic controllers, which should be pretty good witnesses, as they, hopefully have some idea of what aircraft look like. They see it, they try to chase it, they see all of these cars parked, people getting out to watch this. And once other witnesses came forward, they decided they would come out with this story. But many, many people called the Danbury police that night, and the standard response was, "Stable people do not report UFOs." So that was the kind of treatment. And, why would witnesses bother with the ridicule? They just kept it to themselves. I am constantly being kept busy by people from the 1980s who never told their story and now want to tell it. It's just remarkable how many people keep coming out of the woodwork. Okay, here's a face you might recognize with the pipe on the right, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who ran Blue Book, was a Blue Book advisor, and then started the Center for UFO Studies. On the left is Dennis Sant. Unfortunately, we just lost him. Fabulous man, wonderful sighting. His sighting was so remarkable that J. Allen Hynek came out from Chicago to talk to Dennis. There was an enormous mass sighting, March 17th, 1983. So just a few weeks after that last sighting. Here's Dennis years later. Fortunately, when I wanted to interview him, he hadn't spoken to anybody for years about this and said, yes, now's the time to start talking about it again. Just a sweetheart, somebody you meet and you feel like you've been old friends forever. He saw craft something like this, hovering over Route 84. His house was right next to Route 84. So he and his kids are outside looking at this. He's standing in his backyard. Here he is in his backyard. This tall grassy area was a pond back in the 80s, so that was filled with water. He's standing there, and guess what he does? He thinks, boy, I wish I could get a better look at this. I wish it would come closer. Guess what happens? Like instantly, the craft turns and comes straight for him, hovers over this pond at treetop level. And he said, the bright lights, the lights reflected in the water. It was a massive, again, V boomerang type shaped craft. He said it was lit up like daylight with all of this. And he admitted, he said, started to get a little nervous, as curious and fascinated as he was. You can't let something 100 yards lit up, hovering silently over your head about 100 feet. I can understand you getting a little nervous. And as soon as he started to get fear, the craft started moving away. And he always regrets, not standing there for every minute and wishing it would stay. The following week, March 24th. So we are getting mass 5,000 people sightings about every week or two in 1983. Everybody said, well, why aren't there any pictures? Well, this man, Jeff Salmonese, I spoke to him years later. He was a 17-year-old photography student in high school. He comes out of class the night of the 24th, sees this brightly lit triangular shaped object. And if you can see, it's beaming a light down to, it almost looks like water it's reflecting off of. And so he brought this photo after he developed it, brought it to the police, and they said, oh, it's just a formation of small planes, nothing to worry about. So he just stuffed the photo away for 30, 40 years, thinking he didn't have anything. But clearly, this looks like a very solid one object. But that was the type of ridicule and dismissiveness people in authority had. Nothing to see here, move along. So he didn't realize the importance of what he had. The film I made on the Hudson Valley wave was with a production company called Big Guy Media. And I think you can see in the middle of your screen there, that's the big guy, Felix. And he's putting a microphone on little Maureen Davis, who's a reference librarian, who had an astonishing sighting in September of 1985 in the town of Yorktown Heights. She's sitting in her car waiting for her husband to come home at the bus stop. She's going to pick him up and bring him home. And above her was a craft of enormous proportions. I asked her, was it the size of a football field? She's like, no. And I'm mentioning all these things. Was it the size of this? Was it the size of that? She said it was the size of a football stadium. And I've heard this many times, people saying baseball or football stadiums, absolutely enormous. And she is the only one I know of who actually saw inside one of these craft. She said there was a circular opening that a red light or ball came out of. I have heard this dozens and dozens of times about a red light or ball going in and out of craft. I don't know if you have any cases like that there. This happened all the time in the 1980s and still does. So when when this opening was open, she looked up inside she had a good angle looking into it. And plus it was huge. And she said it was like the balconies on the side of an apartment building. They were lit up and there were definitely several levels inside. So this was not a mirage, a balloon. This was a structured craft with many levels. So she's staring at this thing like, what am I looking at? The red light comes back, goes back inside the craft, and the opening is gone. She was very specific. She said she didn't see a door sliding. She didn't see, some people described like a camera iris opening or closing. She said just 1 second, the opening was there, and then it wasn't. Boy, I wish I was sitting next to Maureen Davis in that car for that sighting. So I don't want to neglect circular craft. There were a very high percentage of discs and craft, a lot that looked like this. An artist did this rendition I gave him a lot of witness sketches. And so many times, it seems like no matter where I am in the country giving a lecture, when I put this image up, people gasp and hands go up and this is what I saw. And many, many sightings. This one in particular, summer of 1984. This is a witness sketch she gave me. She's in her kitchen ironing. It's broad daylight. She looks out these sliding glass doors and she sees this circular craft with windows and lights around it. She runs outside. Her parents come out. It is moving so slowly. She is walking along underneath it as it's moving. Clearly can see immense detail in this metallic circular craft. She calls the local police department and she says, can you tell that the town was Lake Oscawana? She said, can you tell me what is going over Lake Oscawana? And rather than give her some, flippant remark, the exasperated policeman who'd been getting inundated with calls and obviously saw it himself simply said, I'll be damned if we know, lady. So they were just as perplexed as everybody else. So I want to skip ahead to 1992. I've superimposed. This is a sketch, this yellowish one that I put on top of the other. This is a sketch in a town 40 minutes away, 8 years later. This craft, which looks remarkably like the other one, doesn't it? The series of rectangular windows interspaced with round lights. This craft was so low over her house, she thought it was going to crush the house. This was a beautiful summer's day. People are pouring out of their houses. Hundreds probably of witnesses standing in the street watching this craft. So here's where it gets even stranger, because 90% of the people in the street looking at this craft saw this, a circular craft, with these square lights and windows and round lights. About 10%, and I've talked to people in both groups, did not see this at all. They saw a solid black triangle with a single white light in each corner. What the heck is going on? I kind of made a joke and said, would the pilot hit? You're not supposed to hit 2 buttons. You're only supposed to hit 1 button. We're either supposed to look like a saucer or a triangle. What is going on? How are they messing with people's minds? Was it a black triangle? Was it a metallic disc? Was it neither? Was it something completely different? I have no answer, But as I said, and these people still argue today, 30 years later, and they're like, what are you talking about? It was a disc. What are you, crazy? It was a black triangle. So there are other cases where people see craft changing shape, and some people focus on different aspects of a craft, but to have people literally standing shoulder to shoulder to see two completely different things is just remarkable. So we're out of the big wave of the 1980s, but activity in the Hudson Valley didn't stop. In the 90s, it shifted predominantly to this area called Pine Bush, New York. Tiny little town. This West Searsville Road here, you can see some houses lining the streets. In the 90s, these were all farmers' fields. This was a rural area. Any given night of the week, hundreds of people from 3 different states would drive 2 hours to park along West Searsville because so much was going on constantly. And one of the trademarks of the Pine Bush wave was craft and lights would be seen coming out of the ground and going into the ground. Now, this is a sketch a witness made for me from 1995. You can see her little stick figure that says me. That's where she was standing. So she's standing there, and you can see in the distance there's this large ring she sketched. She said up out of the ground came this swirling, sparkling light mass. She described it as almost looking like a ring of Saturn coming up out of the ground, an electrical swirl. And it's never a good idea to run towards something that looks like it's electrical that just came out of the ground. But she is so fascinated. She runs full tilt towards this thing. Fortunately, I think for her sake, it had dissipated and gone back into the ground before she reached it. But she said on the ground around her, on the side of the road, fireworks, those little sparklers, those sticks that you light and they sparkle. She said it was like sparklers coming out of the ground. So some intense electrical activity was going on, whether it was natural, whether it was, it sounds highly unnatural to me. But again, this is the kind of thing that was going on Pine Bush for many, many years. Things are still happening in Pine Bush. This is a circular craft, obviously, that has those classic flying saucer lines. This was just 2015 on West Searsville Road. There are still some fields there, and this house is adjacent to a field. They see this craft. It's hovering over the field. It doesn't look like it has landed. It looks like it's a couple of feet above the ground. Witnesses get within 10 feet of this craft. It's, again, so remarkable. And fortunately, they thought once it took off, this was the tall grass. Can you see the white spot? That's where the tall stalks were broken and pushed down. There were they found 3 circular areas in this big field where the craft had been hovering, and you can see that it did physically break and push down these tall stalks here of whatever vegetation that is. A MUFON field investigator did come within a couple of days, and within these circles, the radiation levels were 7 times normal. And the young man who got the closest to the craft did get ill, and it could have been radiation exposure. So again, never a good idea to run towards a swirling vortex of energy that comes out of the ground, and probably not a good idea to get within 10 feet of a craft that you don't know what kind of energy or radiation it's emitting. But I have to say, knowing who I am, if I saw a craft, I'd probably run to within 10 feet of it as well. So, abductions. When I started my research many years ago, I thought predominantly I'm going to hear about distant lights in the sky. And boy, was I wrong. My first book, Abductions, was the largest chapter. All of those incredibly intense close sightings in the wave of the 1980s, many, many, many hundreds of people had missing time as a result, had multiple encounters, generational encounters, their parents, them, their kids. So the wave of the 80s was not just really close sightings. There was something else going on. And, maybe in 3 years, Cheryl, if you have me back, I'll just talk about abductions, because I could talk all night about them. But I just want to talk about one. In the field of abductions, of course, Bud Hopkins was a real pioneer. And in 1979, Bud Hopkins was on a local radio station. It was actually at my local radio station I used to listen to, WRKL. And he's talking about abductions, and a woman calls up, and she said she's a retired school teacher, and in a town called Spring Valley, which was just the next town over to where I grew up, she saw what she described as a metallic-looking dirigible with portholes, and she said time stood still. She was rooted to the spot. We hear this all the time. People are frozen. They cannot move. This did not happen in bed. This was not sleep paralysis. She was playing in her backyard. When she sees this craft, she can't move. By the time it goes away, she gets back home. Her mother scolds her for being gone so long. What she thought was a few minutes was, I think, at least an hour. So missing time. You say, okay, this is a classic post Betty and Barney Hill description of an abduction. But I'll get to the date in a moment. Afterwards, she developed an intense fear of this happening again. She was terrified of being alone. She panicked whenever she had to go to a doctor or get an examination. That PTSD, that post-traumatic abduction experience. So again, all of this is what we would describe as, if there is such a thing, classic abduction and result. The kicker is this happened to her in 1929. So there are other very early, I've come across a few abduction scenario cases. So not only has this bizarre little Hudson Valley had intense UFO sightings going back well over 100 years, we are pushing a solid century of abductions as well. So I hope this gives you some idea. This is why I'm always busy, because this has been happening for so many generations, still is going on. I'm interviewing a man tomorrow who had a sighting in the 1980s and never spoke about it, and now feels comfortable coming forward. So I'll have even more eyewitnesses to add to that wave of the 80s. So again, my podcast. I have a Facebook page, Hudson Valley UFOs. And if anybody, I'll certainly take questions now, but if you have questions or comments, or I have to ask people for help because I'm very interested in rectangular, square-shaped UFOs. I'm collecting cases, and if you have any, I would love to hear them. And with that, I will unshare.
Thank you, Linda. That's fascinating. And, I'm always amazed at how similar those reports of decades past are to even recent times. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same in this field.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Love your work.
Thank you.
Just do it so well. And yes, I would love to have you back. Maybe not another 3 years, maybe a bit earlier.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you all. It's such a pleasure speaking to people who are informed and have information to share with me. So thank you.